Mr. Akisson, thanks for joining me.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Ryan.
Well, the Chamber has been very active in the last couple of years, especially about putting a spotlight on education issues. I want to start with that. Tell me, what do you and the Chamber hope the General Assembly can get done in this session and the next couple to redo the education system?
Well, education is the top priority of the Chamber. In other words, it's the top priority of the business community in Kentucky. We've written that into our strategic plan. And so we are naturally interested in seeing progress. If you had 100 business people in a room together and said, what needs to be fixed about education, you might have about 100 different answers. What we try to do is pull all that together through our policy committees so that we can have a reasonable legislative agenda for each session. And even though this is a short session, a non-budget session, and one in which politics sort of is on the horizon, the governor's race, we think that just because the economy's tight, money's tight, and there are politics on the horizon, that's no reason why we shouldn't make progress in education. So there are certain things that we are watching this time.
Starting with what?
Well, the principal selection bill, for example, giving superintendents more say in who the principals in a particular district are. A superintendent is held responsible for the scores, for the progress or the lack of progress in a school system. So we feel like the superintendent should have more say in who the rank and file leaders are at the school level. Also, another major issue for us is one that the governor and the School Boards Association and some others have endorsed, the school board, the state school board, and that's raising the mandatory age, the dropout age from 16 to 18. We think it's important because of the job situation in Kentucky these days. Unfortunately, somebody who drops out of high school is really not going to have very many options in the world of work today.
Yeah, I think Time Magazine, in fact, just had a piece on that where they showed the percentage of jobs going to people by education, and it's very slim for those who don't have a high school.
That's right. It's a really, to drop out of high school the way you might have been able to get away with a generation or two ago and still get a job in the coal mines or in a manufacturing plant or on a barge or something. Those jobs really aren't available. If you look at unemployment today, sure, it's still bad in the 9 and 10% range, but for high school dropouts, it's over 15%. For college-educated folks, it's less than 5%. Right. So sending that message that it is not, that our Commonwealth is not encouraging people to drop out of school and say, well, they weren't doing so great in school, we just push them on out. We can't do that anymore. We need everybody. And
the Chamber has also made some recommendations in terms of better ways to maybe recruit teachers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. We really feel like that you've got to have excellent teachers. That's where the education system touches the lives of children. And so getting the cream of the crop in college to go into education is a challenge. You've got pay issues, and we are very much for looking at differentiated roles within a school. And if a teacher is performing in an excellent fashion, that person should be rewarded financially. And I know that's where we bump up against the teachers union all the time.
Right, the Kentucky Education Association is opposed to that.
That's right, and that's unfortunate because, I mean, here you have the business community of Kentucky through the Chamber, you have Secretary Arne Duncan in Washington, you've got President Obama, who see that that's not the way it can work anymore. That's just not, a teacher is not a teacher is not a teacher, and we've got to be able to offer differentiated roles and differentiated pay scales.
What about on the other end of the spectrum, maybe the lower performing teachers I guess you can walk into any school and I've heard some education experts say it's sometimes very obvious about who the worst teachers are, that the students are not engaged, that kind of thing. Should there be something in place to maybe weed out the 5%, you know?
Yes.
So how would you do that?
Well, that gets into a whole discussion of tenure laws, which are not a part of this legislative period per se. But one thing that is a part of this legislation, or this legislature this time, is the debate over charter schools. And frankly, the Kentucky Chamber has changed its position in the last couple of years. We were very much a part in the early 1990s of the education reform movement at that time and endorsed CARA.
And in fact, business leaders were a driving force on the third floor of the Capitol,
That's right,
drumming up support from lawmakers.
That's right, including the tax increase that was associated with education reform at that time. But things have changed now, and the notion of charter schools in limited situations, and in our view, and in the view of, I think, the state school superintendent and others, is that where you have schools that are chronically underperforming, schools that just aren't giving kids the start. And you can talk about all the socioeconomic factors, et cetera, but if you see a school that is chronically underperforming, then it's time to change. It's time to consider alternatives. And we are very much in favor of allowing those kinds of alternatives.
Do charter schools, would they undermine public schools, though? Having that option, would it undermine the confidence in the public schools?
There's an honest public policy debate about whether full-blown charter schools in any urban or suburban or rural situation might cause some erosion in that regard. But what we favor is in a very limited circumstance, and the State Board of Education favors this too. And we bump up against the teachers union again because they want to protect teachers at all costs. But we think that where there are significant underperforming schools, there should be the alternative in place where you could go in and charter a school and attempt to get better results.
Now, you mentioned the not fight, but you mentioned the effort to get CARA passed in 1990 and the business industry's involvement in that. Are we getting to the point where a similar effort might be needed to make some of these reforms in education that the Chamber is pushing for?
I think Senate Bill 1 was a huge updating of the reform of the early 90s.
That's the new testing that was passed a couple of years ago.
And that's the most significant change probably in a decade at least. So you had CARA a generation ago in the early 90s. You had Senate Bill 1 that is being implemented now with new requirements. And that's a very positive thing. So while all of us have opinions about schools and some people want to completely start over and that sort of thing, I think right now the Chamber would favor responsible incremental changes and responsible incremental progress. And when you have the White House and the Secretary of Education and a good part of Congress calling for those same types of things, we think it's time to implement some of those in Kentucky.
Last thing, real briefly, higher education. We haven't talked about that. Right now the funding has really flattened over the last 10 years. Is it time to really drum up support for that?
We are very interested in higher education because that's where the training of the workforce takes place, especially at the level of the community and technical colleges. And yes, higher education has been hammered by some of the budget cuts. That's where our leaky bucket message comes in. We talk about how Medicaid, corrections, and public employee health benefits have taken most of the new dollars that the economy can create, and the victim of that is our education system, including higher education. So yes, we need to see incremental progress in that regard, part of which is to try to protect their piece of the pie and not let it erode anymore. One thing that was very positive in the last session of the legislature, that just occurred in 2010, was that the transfer of credits. It's always been a confusing system. You go to a community college and you take 101 and you want to be a nurse, and then you transfer to go to a 4-year degree program and they say, well, that math doesn't count anymore. Well, under this new proposal, there's common numbering within the community college system, and a student entering higher education knows more about where their credits will transfer. That was real progress.